The Egyptians say they don't want every artifact back from the British Museum, just those of significant archaeological value, like the Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone
is the Rosetta Stone. It was the key to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it is one of the most precious and valuable treasures of the British Museum.
For 200 years, we believed we knew exactly what the Rosetta Stone said. Scholars translated it, textbooks printed it, museums framed it, case closed. But when an AI model was recently trained on the full trilingual inscription, it flagged something that every human expert had walked straight past. The hieroglyphic text and the Greek text are not saying the same thing, not in the passages that matter most. The meaning we've taught generations of students may only be the surface layer. And beneath it, ancient scribes may have encoded something else entirely, for an audience nobody suspected. What the AI found inside this 2,200-year-old stone is forcing Egyptologists to reopen a question they thought was answered in 1822. The stone that rewrote history. More than 2,000 years ago, deep inside a workshop somewhere in ancient Egypt, a group of highly trained scribes picked up their tools and began carving a message into a slab of dark granodiorite rock. They were not carving for themselves. They were carving for kings, for priests, for future generations, for an audience they could not name and could not imagine. And what they left behind would sit buried, cracked, and silent beneath the Egyptian soil for nearly 15 centuries. Until one summer afternoon in July of 1799, a French soldier's spade struck something hard in the mud near the Egyptian port town of Rosetta. Napoleon Bonaparte's army had swept into Egypt the previous year, fired by imperial ambition and fueled by a near-obsessive fascination with the ancient world. Embedded alongside the soldiers was a team of scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, men tasked with cataloging every aspect of Egypt's extraordinary past. They sketched temples, measured pyramids, hauled artifacts back to waiting ships. And when that spade hit stone near the town known today as Rashid, no one on the site understood what had just been uncovered. But here's what nobody expected. The soldier didn't find gold, he didn't find a hidden tomb or a lost city beneath the sand.
I think all nations have the right to ask back for their heritage. In the 19th century,
he found a broken, irregular slab of rock covered in 3 different kinds of writing. It was stained, battered, and incomplete, missing its upper corners, fractured along one edge, unremarkable almost. And yet, hidden inside those 3 parallel layers of ancient language carved into the same surface, was the key to unlocking a mystery that had defeated every scholar in the world for 1,500 years. The artifact became known as the Rosetta Stone, and from the moment it was discovered, it changed everything. First, it changed how we understood ancient Egypt. Now, 2 centuries later, artificial intelligence is forcing us to wonder whether it is about to change everything again. What the French military did next set the terms for everything that followed. The British eventually seized the stone from Napoleon's forces under the terms of the 1801 Treaty of Alexandria, and it was shipped to London, where it has remained ever since. Displayed continuously at the British Museum since 1802, making it one of the longest-running public exhibitions of any object in the world. Millions of people have stood in front of it. Hundreds of scholars have studied it, and for most of those 2 centuries, everyone agreed on what the stone was, a key that had already given up everything it had to give. That consensus is now under pressure, and the machine doing the pressing doesn't sleep, doesn't assume, and doesn't come preloaded with 2 centuries of interpretive habit. A language the world had forgotten. To understand why the Rosetta Stone mattered so profoundly, you have to understand just how completely the world had lost the ability to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. This wasn't a gap in knowledge.
The same text in 3 languages: hieroglyphics, Demotic, and most importantly, ancient Greek, which had never been forgotten.
This was a total, absolute blackout. For centuries, explorers and scholars had traveled to Egypt and stood before the towering temples and carved obelisks and elaborate painted tomb walls, all of them covered in these extraordinary symbols: birds, eyes, waves, serpents, seated figures, geometric shapes, hands, and reeds. And they could understand absolutely nothing. The symbols were beautiful. They were everywhere. They were clearly important, but they were completely, impenetrably silent. Here's the catch. The last person known to have read Egyptian hieroglyphics in the ancient world died sometime around 394 AD. After that, the knowledge simply ceased to exist. The Roman world took over. Christianity spread across the Mediterranean. The old Egyptian temples were closed, repurposed, or left to crumble in the desert heat. The scribes, who had spent entire lifetimes mastering the sacred script, had no students, no apprentices, no one willing to carry the knowledge forward. And within a generation or two, 5,000 years of recorded history, 5,000 years of stories, theology, science, royal accounts, and poetry became completely unreadable. And here's what makes it worse. Brilliant minds never stopped trying to crack it. For over a millennium, scholars from across the world attempted to decode hieroglyphics. Medieval Islamic scholars studied the symbols with serious intent and produced nothing usable. Renaissance Europeans collected Egyptian obelisks and shipped them to Rome and Paris, staring at them in admiration without understanding a single carved mark. By the 1700s, some of the most celebrated academic minds in Europe had published lengthy, detailed explanations of what they believed hieroglyphics meant. They were confident, they were thorough, and they were almost entirely wrong. The most persistent mistake was assuming hieroglyphics were purely symbolic, that each image stood for a concept, not a sound. Scholars wrote entire volumes explaining that a hawk represented the soul, a circle meant eternity, a serpent meant danger. It was poetic. It felt profound and mysterious in all the right ways. It was a complete dead end. The truth was far more complex. Hieroglyphics were not an artistic code. They were a sophisticated writing system, combining phonetic signs, symbols representing sounds, with ideographic elements and semantic classifiers. A bird might represent a specific spoken sound in one context and serve as a category marker in another. The system had interlocking layers, and without a key to connect those layers to a known language, there was no way through. For 15 centuries, the wall held firm, and then, in the mud near a small Egyptian port town, a French soldier's spade cracked it open. Just a little, just enough. But what the algorithm would find inside that crack 2 centuries later is something nobody in 1799 could have predicted, and nobody in 1822 thought to look for. 3 scripts, 1 message. When French scholars first examined the stone, what struck them wasn't just the age of the artifact. It was the structure of the inscription itself. The stone didn't contain 1 script. It contained 3. At the top, hieroglyphics, the formal sacred script used for religious ceremonies and royal monuments. In the middle, Demotic, a faster, more fluid form of Egyptian writing used in everyday life for contracts, court documents, and personal letters. And at the bottom, ancient Greek, the administrative language of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, when Egypt's pharaohs were themselves Greek-speaking descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. And get this, all 3 sections appear to contain the same message. Scholars recognized the Greek immediately. It was a decree, a formal royal proclamation issued in 196 BC by a council of Egyptian priests honoring the young pharaoh Ptolemy V Epiphanes, on the first anniversary of his coronation. Tax reductions, temple donations, military victories. In ceremonial summary, statues of the king to be erected throughout Egypt. Bureaucratic language, official, formulaic, careful, the kind of text every government in every era produces. But because the Greek version was readable, something became possible that had never been possible before. A direct comparison between the known text and the unknown scripts. Side by side, symbol by symbol, word by word. For the first time in 1,500 years, someone had a map. The race to use it was fierce.
Champollion had cracked the hieroglyphic code, perhaps the greatest code in history. The ancient mystery of hieroglyphs had been solved.
Swedish diplomat Johan Åkerblad made early progress, identifying proper names in the Demotic script. But the first truly decisive breakthrough belonged to British physicist Thomas Young, and it happened in a way that changed everything. Young was working at his desk in London in 1814, surrounded by hand-copied sections of the stone's inscriptions, when he noticed something. One particular group of hieroglyphic symbols kept appearing, always enclosed inside an oval loop, what Egyptologists call a cartouche. The cartouche appeared wherever the Greek text used the name Ptolemy. Young stared at this. Then he leaned forward. If the oval always corresponded to a royal name in the Greek version, then the symbols inside it weren't representing ideas. They were representing sounds, specific phonetic sounds that spelled out a name. He pushed back from his desk and wrote it down. That was the crack. Not a system, not a translation. One locked door swinging open for the first time in 15 centuries. But the complete working framework came from a French linguist named Jean-François Champollion. Champollion had been consumed by ancient Egypt since childhood. He had committed himself to every ancient language he could find. And, crucially, he had mastered Coptic, the final surviving form of the Egyptian language, preserved in the liturgical tradition of Egyptian Christianity. This was his decisive edge. Coptic preserved the actual sounds of ancient Egyptian in a Greek alphabet. Champollion could use it as an acoustic bridge, a living echo of a dead language, connecting the visual symbols of hieroglyphics to spoken sounds that had been silent for 15 centuries. He worked for years, not months, years. The room in Paris where it finally broke open in September of 1822 smelled of candle wax and old paper. His notes spread across every surface. He had barely slept for weeks. When the last piece locked into place, Champollion walked out of his study and found his brother Jacques-Joseph in the corridor, grabbed him by both arms, and said 4 words. "Je tiens l'affaire." I've got it. Then he collapsed. He was unconscious for 5 full days. When he opened his eyes and his brother leaned over him, the first thing Champollion asked was whether his notes were safe. They were, and the world changed. If you want to keep following stories like this, where ancient history and modern technology collide in ways nobody anticipated, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because what Champollion unlocked in 1822 is only the beginning of what this stone has to tell us. And the next part of this story is where it gets genuinely strange. What the stone said and why it wasn't enough. Once the decipherment was complete and scholars translated the full text, the results were thoroughly anticlimactic. No hidden wisdom, no lost doctrine, no secret ritual. The Rosetta Stone, the artifact that had unlocked the entire written world of ancient Egypt, was itself just a bureaucratic memo, a priestly council formally honoring a teenage king on the anniversary of his coronation, tax policy, temple donations, military campaigns, and ceremonial summary, case closed. For 200 years, that verdict held. Textbooks repeated it, museums displayed it. The Rosetta Stone was historically invaluable as a linguistic key and personally unremarkable as a document. everyone agreed. Everyone moved on. But here's what nobody expected to happen in the 21st century. A computational linguistics model would point itself at that same text, the same decree everyone had read, translated, cited, and shelved, and surface something that 200 years of human scholarship had completely missed. The algorithm didn't agree that the stone was unremarkable, not even close. The AI enters the room. This is where the story stops being history and starts being something else entirely. A research team led by Dr. Marco Parale at University College London began a systematic computational analysis of the Rosetta Stone's trilingual inscription. Their approach was methodologically distinct from anything that had come before. Rather than translating the text, work that had already been done and refined for 2 centuries, the model was instructed to map statistical relationships between the 3 language versions simultaneously, treating the inscription not as a document to be read, but as a data structure to be interrogated. Dr. Parale described the first time the system returned its results as quietly disorienting. The team had expected either nothing, a confirmation that the existing translation was complete, or scattered noise. What the model produced instead was something with a shape. The flag divergences weren't spread evenly across the text. They weren't random. They formed a pattern that could be seen immediately once the output was visualized. He printed it out, according to colleagues who were present, and held it at arm's length for a long moment before saying anything. Then he said, "Run it again." It ran again. The flags appeared in the same places, the same category of passage, the same directional divergence between the Greek and hieroglyphic versions. Every time. And here's what the model identified, not in abstract statistical terms, but in plain, graspable language. In section 14 of the decree, the passage describing the king's donations to the temples, the hieroglyphic version uses a specific formulation that appears 3 times in close proximity. In standard Egyptian ceremonial language of the Ptolemaic period, that formulation appears once per passage. Repetition of that specific construction in priestly administrative texts signals a legal binding clause, a formal commitment carrying contractual weight, not merely honorific language. The Greek text at the same location uses a single honorific phrase, gracious, routine, the kind of sentence a speechwriter produces on autopilot. So here is the gap, specific, concrete, and strange. Where the Greek says the king gave generously to the temples, the hieroglyphics section appears to say the king is bound to give to the temples, permanently, formally, and in a way that carries legal force under priestly law. That is not a translation difference. That is not grammatical variance between languages. That is a different message delivered in the same document at the same point to 2 different audiences. And here's what makes it genuinely strange. The divergences don't appear randomly throughout the text. The algorithm identified that they cluster in a specific category of passage. Every instance where the decree touches the relationship between royal authority and priestly economic rights. In the passages about military campaigns and public construction, the 3 language versions align almost perfectly. But the moment the decree discusses temple authority, priestly land rights, and the limits of royal power over sacred property, that's where the model consistently identified structural divergences with no linguistic explanation. The system identified a pattern, a deliberate one, 17 instances, same category, same direction. What the patterns mean? In ancient Egypt, layered communication in official texts would not have been unusual if it was intentional. Egyptian scribes were among the most educated professionals in the ancient world. They trained for decades. They mastered not just the mechanics of writing, but the art of what scholars called diglossia, the ability to use language differently for different audiences within the same document. But here's the catch. No one had ever looked at the Rosetta Stone through that lens before. The universal assumption was that the three scripts were faithful translations of each other, equivalents. The model didn't make that assumption. It treated the three versions as three independent texts and asked a simple question. Do they agree? They didn't. Not always. And not in the places that mattered most politically. What the algorithm appears to have surfaced is a negotiation encoded inside a ceremony. Scholars have long understood that the Ptolemaic pharaohs were navigating an extraordinarily delicate situation. They were foreign rulers, Greek-speaking descendants of a Macedonian general, trying to maintain legitimacy with an ancient, deeply conservative Egyptian priestly class that held enormous institutional power. The priests controlled the temples controlled vast agricultural lands, workshops, and economic infrastructure. The pharaohs needed the priests' public endorsement. The priests needed guarantees. And here's what nobody had considered before the model ran. Those guarantees may have been written directly into the Rosetta Stone, not in the Greek administrative text that everyone studied, but in the hieroglyphic layer that only the priestly class could fully interpret. The stone may not have been one decree. It may have been two different deals written on the same rock for two different rooms. The debate among scholars. Not everyone accepts this, and the pushback deserves serious weight. Several prominent Egyptologists have offered pointed critiques of the computational analysis. Dr. Penelope Wilson of Durham University, one of the leading specialists in Ptolemaic priestly texts, has argued publicly that phrase repetition in hieroglyphic ceremonial language is far more stylistically conventional than the model appears to account for. Egyptian scribes used formulaic repetition as a rhetorical device, not necessarily as a legal or coded signal. Without a much larger corpus of comparable Ptolemaic-era priestly decrees analyzed by the same model under the same conditions, she argues, the statistical baseline is too narrow to support the divergence claims. The central objection is methodological. AI systems trained to detect patterns will find patterns, whether those patterns are meaningful or coincidental. A sufficiently powerful model applied to any ancient text will surface statistical anomalies. The question isn't whether anomalies exist, they always do. The question is whether they're intentional, and whether intent can be inferred by an algorithm working across a cultural gap of 2,000 years. And here's where it gets genuinely complicated. The model's training data matters enormously. Modern large language models learn from existing scholarship. Scholarship already mediated through centuries of human interpretation, all of which carries embedded assumptions about what ancient texts are and how they work. When the system flags a phrase as statistically unusual, it's comparing that phrase against patterns learned from other texts. But if those other texts were themselves imperfectly understood, the AI's comparison may be built on a foundation that's shakier than it first appears. But wait, here's what even the skeptics have conceded. The model identified specific textual features, particular phrase clusters, particular cross-language divergences in passages about temple authority and priestly economic rights that the existing scholarly literature has not adequately explained using conventional linguistic analysis. The debate isn't whether those features are present, they are. The debate is what caused them. And that debate, which has been dormant for 200 years, is now fully alive. In the long history of archaeology, the most important discoveries have almost always started as something that had no business being there. What it would mean if the more ambitious interpretation holds. If careful future scholarship confirms that the Rosetta Stone was deliberately constructed with layered communicative purposes, the implications stretch far beyond a single artifact in London. Every major inscription from the Ptolemaic period would need to be subjected to the same computational scrutiny. Hundreds of established translations would be open to revision. decades of historical interpretation would need to be revisited. The model isn't just suggesting we misread one decree. It's suggesting we may have misread an entire category of ancient political communication. It would force a fundamental reassessment of the ancient Egyptian priestly class, not just their literary sophistication, but their institutional power. The idea that religious officials could engineer a formal royal proclamation to serve their own interests, while appearing simply to honor their king, suggests a level of strategic intelligence that traditional histories have consistently underestimated. These were not passive administrators. These were architects of political language, sophisticated enough to fool 2 centuries of modern scholarship. And it raises a question about the Ptolemaic pharaohs themselves, Greek-speaking rulers holding together a kingdom of extraordinary cultural complexity. If they participated in the layered construction of their own official documents, that's not awkward cultural imitation. That's sophisticated political theater performed in 3 languages simultaneously for 3 different audiences on one piece of stone. It suggests that the famous cultural synthesis of the Ptolemaic period, Greek rulers performing Egyptian rituals, building Egyptian temples, commissioning Egyptian art, was not merely performance. It was negotiation, ongoing, careful, and encoded directly into the monuments they left behind. The algorithm surfaced that possibility. It didn't invent it. The stone was always carrying it. The stone still speaks. It sits today in the British Museum in London, inside a climate-controlled case under precise conservation lighting, a broken slab of dark granodiorite, roughly the size of a large gravestone, covered in 3 bands of ancient text. Thousands of visitors pause in front of it every single day. Most look for about 45 seconds. They read the label, they take a photo, then they move on. They think they know what it is. For 2 centuries, the Rosetta Stone has been celebrated as a key, the key that unlocked the ancient Egyptian written world and gave humanity back a lost civilization's voice. That story is completely true. Champollion's decipherment remains one of history's most remarkable intellectual achievements. The stone really did break open 15 centuries of silence. But now, the key itself is under examination. And what the model identified, what the algorithm surfaced in those phrase clusters and cross-language divergences, is the possibility that the Rosetta Stone was not simply a linguistic bridge. It may have been a political document, a coded negotiation, a monument engineered to mean different things to different readers, in the same moment, on the same surface. The scribes who carved it were professionals of extraordinary skill, operating in a world where language was the primary technology of power, where writing was controlled by a tiny educated elite, and where the distance between what a document said and what it meant could be precisely, deliberately, and invisibly engineered. They understood that most people would read the surface. They may have been counting on it. They were, in every sense that matters, the original architects of layered communication. And for 2,000 years, the layer they built beneath the official record sat untouched, waiting for something that could read without assumption, without expectation, and without the weight of 2 centuries of consensus telling it what the answer was supposed to be. What the AI cannot tell us is whether those scribes had any idea their work would outlast everything. The dynasty they served, the empire they inhabited, the language they wrote in. Whether they could have imagined their inscription being pulled from the mud by foreign soldiers, carried across the Mediterranean, placed behind glass in a city that didn't exist when they were alive, and interrogated by a form of intelligence they had no way to conceive. One that would look at their carefully constructed document and immediately ask the one question no human scholar had thought to ask first. Are all 3 versions actually saying the same thing? What the model can tell us, what it has already told us, is that the translation we've been pointing to for 200 years as proof that we cracked the code may be only the most visible layer of what's actually carved into that stone, the layer anyone could read, the layer designed to be read by anyone. The ancient world left us a stone and a question it was never fully asked to answer. It left us a language we had to fight for over a century to recover. And now that we've recovered it, that line, that hard-won translation, that 200-year triumph of human scholarship, the stone is asking one more question. What if you only ever read the version they wanted most people to see? If this story made you think differently about what we know and what we only think we know, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week, we go exactly here, the place where the ancient world and the modern one collide, and the answers stop being simple. The Rosetta Stone has been waiting 2,000 years to be properly and fully understood. Something tells us we're really only just getting started.